Hey you guys, this is your girl Najwa. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please do me a favor. Hit the like and subscribe button. Hit the bell so you know whenever I post a video. So guys, I want to talk to you about something today that is quite close to my heart. And there is a saying. You guys have probably all heard it. We've all heard it. If you don't know where you come from, you don't know where you're going. History repeats itself. I look at my country of birth, although I live in Europe, I'm American, and I look at my country of birth and the issues around race relations that is happening right now, and the intense racism in both overt ways and institutional levels that is happening in my country of birth right now truly breaks my heart. And what breaks my heart the most is the rewriting of history. I think that's the most sinister part of it. The rewriting of history and people of color and black people in America being told to just get over it when it was only 100 years ago that the Tulsa Massacre happened. When it was only 200 years ago that Harriet Tubman shuttled black slaves up to the north to freedom. When it was only 60 years ago that those white civil rights activists that worked alongside Martin Luther King were brutally murdered by the Klan. And what happens is, I feel quite bad for young people. It's the group of people who I feel are most affected by the chaos that is going on right now in American society. Adults have failed young people. Adults have failed young people by refusing to acknowledge the horrors of slavery and refusing to acknowledge how, as the late great John Lewis said, the seeds of slavery and racism are still alive today, and people are sowing those seeds of racism today. So I want to talk to you a little bit about Daniel Penny, and it's probably a little bit of I'm going to talk to you about a little bit of history, but we're going to talk about Daniel Penny and more importantly Jordan Neely, the black man who lost his life for asking for food and water on a train. I mean, he had to be so hungry and so he had to feel so rejected by society and caught in this cycle of poverty and rejection from society, who cares very little about its homeless and even less about its people of color who are homeless, you know. I'm sorry, guys. And instead of people showing someone who was homeless and hungry compassion, he was brutally. I'm sorry that I'm crying, but I think people don't realize how surprising but unsurprising these instances of racism are towards black people. The complete lack of consideration towards black lives, towards black men. And For so long, black people in America have had, and in the Western world, this is not just happening in America, black people have had to be extremely resilient because over and over and over again, history has repeated itself. And I'm going to prove to you that history has repeated itself and that white supremacy and institutional racism is very much alive in the U.S. and in the Western world in general. You know, I may know more of the stories of blacks being persecuted in the U.S., but we know it happens in Australia, it happens in the UK, it happens in France, it happens in Spain, it happens in Italy. And until this sordid past is truly addressed and continually addressed, you know, continually is the key here. Because at some point it was like, okay, we've got over it. That whole slavery thing, that whole racist thing, we should be over that by now. No, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. We're still talking about King Arthur. We're still talking about Winston Churchill. We're still talking about Socrates. We're still talking about Plato. Slavery and the enslavement, the barbaric treatment of black people yanked out of their homeland and brought into the Western world is a stain on history that will always be there. And that persona of white privilege, of white fragility, of white supremacy, it can't erase it. It can't make a few improvements here and there and say, okay, we're over it, we're done. It has to continually be acknowledged because it is a part of history. It's not something that can just be wiped away. So, before we talk about, you know, how $2.8 million was raised for a killer, for Daniel Penny, a killer, who just happened to be white. $2.8 million, $165,000 was raised for the homeless man who was begging for food and water that he killed. But $2.8 million was raised for Jordan Neely. I've been following it for a couple weeks now. And I really feel like I had to pray and digest and take commune with nature and kind of really reflect on how I was going to explain my perspective on this. And I think a lot of what the black perspective is on this as a whole, before I came to, I really needed to sort of speak with my spirit and speak with the spirit, you know, to get here. But we're going to talk a little bit about the campaign that raised money for a killer, a Daniel Penny. And we're going to talk about how it is surprising that people are applauding murderous white supremacy in America, but also why it's not very surprising. Okay? Okay, so let's chat about this. So this is an article from The Conversation, published, written by Jeremy Snyder, and this was published on the 31st of May, 2023. The article is entitled, Daniel Penny's Go Sin Go campaign crowdfunding primarily benefits the most privileged. It says a former United States Marine was recently charged with second-degree manslaughter for fatally choking a 30-year-old black man, Jordan Neely, on a New York subway train. A Give, Send, Go crowdfunding campaign has raised over $2.8 million from 57,000 donations for Daniel Penny's legal expenses. It's the second largest fundraiser on that platform. We'll end it there. So contrarily, this is an article from nybreaking.com, written by James, no last name. Jordan Neely's family is filing a wrongful death lawsuit against Daniel Penny. This is from May 27, 2023. It says, family of homeless Jordan Neely, who was held in a stranglehold by ex-Marine Daniel Penny, plans to file a wrongful death lawsuit. Jordan Neely's aunt Carolyn announced her intention to file a wrongful death lawsuit against Daniel Penny on May 1st. Penny was recorded holding Neely in a stranglehold aboard a New York City subway. The homeless person died shortly afterwards. Penny is charged with manslaughter in the case. His legal defense fund, which can also be used for civil liabilities, has reached $2.8 million. It goes on to say that, meanwhile, a GoFundMe fundraiser for Jordan Neely's family, set up by his aunt Carolyn, has raised $150,000. That money will go towards Neely's funeral, burial, and public viewing, which was held on May 15th. So you have $2.8 million raised for a racist killer, and you have $150,000 raised for the man that he killed. Now, you can go and you can put the argument in my comments that Jordan Neely was a vagrant, Jordan Neely was a solicitor who was yelling. Does yelling warrant taking someone's life and taking the law into your own hands? Daniel Penny is not the law. Those other two individuals who were with him are not the law. And beyond that, for someone to be completely emotionally incapable of reaching into their hearts and finding some compassion and handing Jordan Neely $1 instead of handing him an early grave, something is wrong with you. And the place that you're going to is not going to be pleasant. History repeats itself, but so does karma. Because although in the short term it may seem like Daniel Penny will get away scot-free, and those people who murdered abolitionists back in the 1800s got away scot-free, and those people who murdered both white and black civil rights activists in the 1960s got away scot-free, but they did not. Eventually, justice catches up. The justice of us human beings catches up. And karma, God, ultimately, always catches up. But I want to talk to you a little bit about how history repeats itself and how this isn't extremely surprising. The problem with excusing the bad behavior of white supremacists is that it stains the community. It stains the white American community much more than it stains the black American community. The problem is that this persona of white fragility and white supremacy will attempt to protect murderers. They will attempt to protect racist ideals. I'm going to read you a few things about those white abolitionists who were in the 1800s, and a little bit about those white civil rights activists who were in the 1960s. The key thing to remember here is that they were persecuted for their association with wanting to see improvement of the lives of black Americans. So they were guilty by association. What I want to emphasize with that is that whatever you're saying that your reasons are, whatever you're saying that your reasons are for supporting Penny, if you're saying it's because he was a Marine, you're saying because you think he was a law-abiding citizen who protected the people on that train that day, whatever your thoughts are, you are staining your good name by upholding ideas that are associated with racism and violence and aggression and white supremacy. And history is never forgiving for those individuals. You might win the battle with that type of ideology, but you're not going to win the war with that type of ideology, because eventually justice will catch up and it'll come back around. And you know what? I just don't see where anyone who has ever taken a stance on something like that has ended with what, if you're a person of faith, honestly, what would be the qualifying characteristics for someone to actually be one with God, to be righteous in the eyes of God? The Bible is very, very, very clear about the Bible is very clear about fraud, about not having compassion. The same with the Quran, the same with the Torah, the same with the Bhagavad Gita and the Vedas, the same with the Book of Tao, you know, any way you spin it. And if you're looking at it just from, if you're, say, an atheist, and you're looking at it from an atheistic standpoint, same thing, karma. Nature works its way out, and the law works its way out. The law exists for a reason. Daniel Penny broke the law that day. The same way that the people, the white supremacists who killed these abolitionists, who killed these civil rights activists, they broke the law. And eventually the law caught up with them. Some of them in old age. It's like they lived with the stain of taking a human life on their heart their whole lives. And then in their old age, instead of spending that time with their family and friends and loved ones, they spent rotting in a jail cell. And me as a Christian, I have to believe after they passed, they did not get salvation in heaven. They did not get welcome into the gates of heaven with open arms. That's not what happens. So I truly, truly urge you guys, especially young people, if people are flagging what the influential voices in your life are calling justice, other people are flagging it as racism and white supremacy, I truly, truly encourage you, I heed you to listen. You don't want to end up down the wrong road. You don't want to ruin your life. You don't want to ruin your spiritual well-being. A part of Black history has always been so much of a collectivist history, you know. So much of civil rights movements in the U.S., despite whatever you have been told, has mostly come from a place of nonviolence, peaceful protesting. You look at Martin Luther King Jr., you look at the Tulsa Massacre, you look at many of the civil rights movements, you know, headed by leaders like Martin Luther King and John Lewis and Jesse Jackson and the Reverend Al Sharpton. Peaceful. Those have been peaceful movements. And today, I think young Black people are angry, and rightfully so. But beautiful young Black African people, remember, come from a place of nonviolence. I know it's hard, but you don't want to put yourself in the same light as the oppressor, and you don't want to risk your spiritual salvation for a little bit of earthly vendetta, you know, a little bit of earthly vengeance. So let's talk about this. So a few white abolitionists. So this is an article from grunge.com. It's called Abolitionists Who Were Murdered for Their Beliefs by Kathy Benjamin. And David Broderick, it says, by 1859, it was clear that the country was ripping apart over the issue of slavery. 1859. That was less than 200 years ago, guys. So 2 generations ago, great-great-grandparents were still dealing with slavery. So as much as a lot of people in the U.S. namely that persona of white fragility, white supremacy, white privilege, just says, oh my God, slavery was so long ago, will you guys just get over it? No, history will never get over it. In the history books, this needs to be discussed. The problem with people like Ron DeSantis is he is attempting to whitewash and change history. History can't be changed. It's part of why an oral tradition is so important within black homes, because history keeps attempting to trying to whitewash and rewrite the history of the persecution of black and brown people. You can't change it. It's still there. That stain is still there. And as much as you try to ignore it, the more it's going to come back. Acknowledge it. Acknowledge it and advocate for awareness. Guys, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid to condemn racism. I know it can be scary, but do not allow yourself to be silenced. And that goes to anybody, person of color or otherwise. Do not allow yourself to be silenced. And as I've said many times in many videos, what it takes for this problem to really be resolved is for some woke white people to really step in and not be afraid to stand up to their sisters and brothers and say, this is wrong. This is wrong. Please imagine if the tables were just reversed. If it was just flipped on its head and it was blacks who were persecuting and enslaving whites, it would feel just as horrendous. And, you know, part of what I discovered amongst my travels and meeting African people, people from all over Africa and the Caribbeans, meeting people from Ivory Coast and Congo and Togo and Senegal and Jamaica and Haiti, I found a commonality with all of them. And something that I discovered is that you cannot just wash down your history to being black and white. We speak in these terms today, but it's not natural, you know? We come from places, from countries, not from races. You know, and a lot of modern day neo-Nazis in the US, well, you'll hear them say white power a lot. White power, white power. And I get it, you know, there was a black power movement. The difference is white people have not been persecuted 4,000 years. That's the difference. So the other difference is that you cannot water down your history to just being white. You're not just white. You're Italian and Spanish and Scottish and Dutch and British and Armenian and Lithuanian and Polish, you know. Find out your history, your real history. Your history does not lie with white supremacy. And this message is so crucial for young people between the ages of 18 and 24. If you're between the ages of 18 and 24 and you happen to land on this video, please, 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 please continue to do your research into the history of black Americans. School will not teach you the full true story. Go on the internet. You guys are great with the internet. Find out about black people in the Civil War. Find out about black people during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. Find out about the Abolitionists. Find out about Juneteenth. Find out about the Tulsa Massacre. Find out about the Harlem Riots. You have to seek out this history because what you're looking at right now is dangerous. Young people, you're our next leaders. I know I'm not that much older than you, but I'm old enough to have gotten a well-rounded education and an education that actually taught about slavery. and the implications of slavery, what happened thereafter, after freedom, after blacks were able to vote. I was able to learn about that in school and also from my parents. And I was also able to live through seeing a black president. And then after that, everything really, really changed. So I think that what you guys are learning, you know, again, talking to 18 to 24-year-olds, what you're learning and what you learned is different from what I learned. Because I think that the world saw we had a black president. It was too much for that persona of white supremacy and white privilege. And so that is why today you're seeing so many hate groups and neo-Nazi groups, and you are at a very vulnerable age. You're very susceptible. And I think a lot of these people, the reason we see so many young people heading towards hate groups and extremist groups is because they were swayed. Guys, I encourage you, come from a place of nonviolence, from compassion, and do your studying. Put your head down and do your studying and learn about the truth about slavery and about black persecution. And then try and have some empathy. You know what empathy means? It means being able to put yourself in the shoes of someone else. Imagine if it was you. All of these events that have happened to black people, including the ones that you see today. A police officer putting his knee on the neck of a black man for 9 minutes. A guy holding a black guy in a stranglehold on a train for 15 minutes until he passes out and dies. An innocent police officer being stormed into her, police storming into her house and shooting her, thinking she's someone else. No words said, just killing an innocent black person. Being in a church or grocery store in a predominantly black or Asian neighborhood and having your whole family taken away from you. Put yourself in those shoes. Put yourself in the shoes of people coming from a history of having an entire town, like the Tulsa Massacre, having an entire town wiped out by the Ku Klux Klan. Put yourself in those shoes. And then come back and tell me if you think the same about being a part of what society is deeming as a hate group or a white supremacist group. Come back to me. Blacks, whites, Asians, Latinos, I don't care what your skin looks like. Guys, do not be afraid to stand up in the face of racism. Because when you are silenced, that's how it gets perpetuated. Many have lost their lives for this. But it's just that important. It's just that important that many people are willing to risk everything so that history doesn't keep trying to revise itself. And we talk a lot about blacks being out of touch with their roots, with their origins, but black Americans being out of touch with their roots and their origins. But the exact same can be said about white Americans. Because, white Americans just claim themselves to be black. Black Americans just claim themselves to be black. White Americans just claim themselves to be white. Black Americans just claim themselves to be black. But, like we said, you're not just white or black. You're Scottish, or you're Ghanaian, you're Senegalese, or you're Irish. It's get back to your roots. Now, when you look at the history of a lot of European culture, a lot of it is centered around violence. I want to say that it's a bit in the DNA of that persona, in the most baser, animalistic, sinful, negative part. It's truly in the DNA. But it's not just in the DNA of white people, it's in the DNA of people, period. Period. You know what? Let me just read you an excerpt from Mark chapter 7. Because I don't know if you guys are Christian like myself. I don't know if you are I don't know if I don't know what religion you might be, but I think that you have to take a listen to this for a moment. Because with Jesus, he preached these tenets of nonviolence, of compassion, of love, and the Pharisees and the scribes and the traditionalists of the Jewish slash pagan faith of that time were getting caught up on all the wrong things. Hey, why didn't you wash your hands before you came into the temple? Our tradition says you need to wash your hands. And Jesus is like, there's people who are hungry out here and they want to come worship. You're talking about my hands being dirty. So you have to think about that from that perspective. But Jesus, and reading this excerpt from Mark, you have to remember that Jesus spoke about nonviolence and compassion for a reason. Because every human has both good and bad in them. We all have the ability to give into sin, to give into hate, to give into violence. But it is a wise man who chooses love. It is the wise person who chooses love. So, I'm going to read this, but whatever faith or lack of faith that you may have, I just hope that, we can all understand that coming from a place of nonviolence, coming from a place of love and compassion and consideration for our fellow human beings is a virtue. So I'm going to start at verse 14. This is Mark chapter 7 again. And it says, "Again Jesus called the crowd to him and said, 'Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them.' After he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciple asked him about this parable. 'Are you so dull?' he asked. 'Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of their body.' In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. He went on, 'What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person.' Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it. Yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. 'First, let the children eat all they want,' he told her, 'for it is not to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs.' 'Lord,' she replied, 'even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs.' Then he told her, 'For such a reply you may go. The demon has left your daughter.' She went home and found her child laying on the bed and the demon gone. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down the Sea of Galilee, and into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to the heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, epatha, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. Even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them have come a long distance. His disciples answered, But where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. And they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave them thanks and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples broke up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 were present, and he had sent them away. He got on the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. Sorry if I'm messing up these names. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to it. Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for 1 loaf that they had in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another. It is because we have no bread? Because of their discussion, Jesus asked them, Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts so hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears that fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, Do you still not understand? So basically, many times in the Bible where the disciples and the common people couldn't understand what Jesus was saying, it breaks down to something very simple. If you see someone who is unclothed, clothe them. If you see someone who is hungry, feed them. Daniel Penny saw someone who was hungry, and he gave him. And people raised $2 million for this man. If you're one of the people who donated, I need you to truly, truly reflect on what I'm trying to say to you. And it's not literal, the food. The food can be literal, but it's also metaphorical and is spiritual. It's truly human kindness. If you see that someone is in need, whether they're yelling or boisterous or not, tap into that compassion, be Jesus-like, and show them the compassion that they need in that moment. This spiritual food was something that the abolitionists, the white abolitionists who passed for advocating for black people, and the white civil rights activists who passed, that they understood. They saw that blacks were being persecuted, and that spiritual food that Jesus or whoever that they worship, whatever their faith doctrine was, that spiritual fruit that had been placed in their heart, they wished to share it with others. And people who had those elements that Jesus talked about, those sinful elements that, exists inside of you, and you take it in and you put it out, that defiles humanity, like debauchery, like murder, like folly, like fraud, like greed. You know, the people, those Klansmen who white abolitionists, who white civil rights activists. Um, I can't say that those people were happy. I really can't. So truly try to reflect on that. Will it make you happy? If you need to, seek the mental help that you need. If you need to, pursue your passions. Go out into nature. You know, cultivate that time with your family. But also travel in multicultural groups and try and really listen and understand the perspectives of other people, of brown people and black people and marginalized people outside of yourself. So anyway, grunge article from Kathy Benjamin. This was published on, well, updated on February the 2nd, 2023. Abolitionists who were murdered for their beliefs. So, David Broderick, by 1859, it was clear that the country was ripping apart over the issue of slavery. Political arguments were turning violent. Sounds familiar, right? Even in the far-flung, brand-new state of California. According to the ACLU of Northern California, David Broderick, a U.S. Senator, there's a picture of him above, and David Terry, the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, hadn't always been at odds. Apparently, they'd actually been friends. But their political differences proved to be too much for their relationship, even though they were both Democrats. Broderick fought, and just, you know, as someone who studied a bit of everything, including history, keep in mind that the Democrats of the 18th century were likely more resemblant of sort of left-leaning Republicans today. Broderick fought for it to be a slave state. In the end, the Free Soil wing of the party won out. Although, as the National Park Service points out, just because owning a person was illegal in California didn't mean black people had anything even close to equality under the law. Still, Terry's full-on pro-slavery views eventually lost him re-election. He didn't take this well, blaming his former friend for his defeat. Then the two men started openly insulting each other. Finally, Terry challenged Broderick to a duel. And if you don't know, duels really come from Europe. As does, as I said, so many things associated with the history of European descent people comes from violence, you know. If you think about the Crusades, you think about duels, you think about the guillotine, you think about the Round Table of the Knights Round Table. You think about the Vikings. There's so much beautiful history, like river dancing and Celtic knots and illuminated manuscripts. That is beautiful and peaceful. Agriculture that comes from Europe. If you don't study these things to see the parts of your history that are stained with violence and blood and war and hate, as much as those things that are filled with love and beauty and nature and compassion, you will go nowhere. Know your history, guys. The first duel was called off because the crowd was too big, but on September 13th, 1859, it went ahead. After Broderick's gun misfired, Terry shot him straight in the chest. It took Broderick 3 days to die, allegedly saying, "They killed me because I am opposed to the extension of slavery and a corrupt administration. God bless you." God bless you, David Broderick. God bless you. There are more brutal ones. There are more brutal ones that resulted in hanging and shooting, you know. A duel signifies something so, what do you say, from another time and another place, off from a distant land, and incorporating fantasy with fairy tales and reality, princes dueling for the heart of a young woman. But don't get it wrong, this was brutal. This was brutal. And don't forget what it was about. A white person helping black people. And in the end, what really happens is this idea of white supremacy truly self-destructs. So, we talked about those who were less fortunate and did not participate in some beautiful duel, you know. Some were hung. Some white people were hung. So let's talk about Charles Doy. According to House Divided Project, in January 1859, this is the same article from Grunge, 11 enslaved people were running for their lives through Kansas, assisted by 3 white abolitionists and 2 free black men. But slave catchers in the area lay in wait for the group's covered wagons to pass and took them away at gunpoint. At gunpoint. So that there is something to know. If you're supporting Daniel Penny, you know, please don't believe that someday somebody won't turn on you. Somebody of your same race who you think has your same beliefs, because that's what violence and anger and aggression and hate does. It festers and it implodes upon itself. That's what the enemy does. Because there's no love. There's only destruction. So it says, one of the white men, John Doy, pictured sitting, there's a picture above, would riot in prison until he was convicted for his participation in June. Thank you, John Doy. But 1 month later, John escaped from jail with the help of a group of 10 fellow abolitionists, pictured standing, and this picture is wonderful. One of the men who busted John Doy out was his son, Charles. So that also shows you can pass these teachings of nonviolence and of advocacy, of love and compassion to your children. It wasn't just a filial piety that motivated Charles. Like his father, he was a staunch abolitionist. He'd even been driving one of the wagons transporting the freedom seekers when his father was arrested, and had also spent time in prison for it. While John managed to escape death on more than one occasion, Charles would not be so lucky. On July 23, 1860, the New York Times reported that a few weeks earlier, Charles Day had been hung by a pro-slavery mob. Charles and 2 others were arrested on trumped-up charges of stealing a horse. And that's also what this idea of all of those bad, sinful elements that Jesus mentioned in Mark chapter 7 and 8, is that there's secrecy and lying behind it. You know, there's a lack of truth. We're going to see that with the next story about the civil rights movement as well. And it's not even a story, it's history. This is what history has done. But stealing a horse is not what happened, clearly. So why all of the lying? Why all of the deceit? If you're righteous, truly, and don't get it wrong, a lot of these people who perpetrated murder against abolitionists, against civil rights activists, were preachers, priests, bishops in the church, were devout people. What Bible were they reading? That's what I want to ask. One of the men was shot dead, but Charles managed to get away for a little while. He was soon found hiding in a house by the mob, who then murdered him. The New York Times eulogized that while Charles defied danger like a hero, in quotes, he endured suffering with the fortitude of a martyr. Thank you so much, Charles. All right, so let's skip ahead a little bit. I want to talk to you now about some people who were killed during the civil rights movement of the 1960s that was spearheaded by Martin Luther King Jr. Just to show you that this violence, this insidious nature and secrecy of deceit and hate, it implodes upon itself. So if you are participating in it, you could be next. Some black person, some brown person might be first, but you could be next. So this is from the Washington Post, article labeled, "A White Mother Went to Alabama to Fight for Civil Rights, The Klan killed her for it. Perspective by Donna Britt, and this is from December 15th, 2017, the article is. So it says Viola Liuzzo left, oh, okay, this is a picture, left, was helping to shuttle black demonstrators between Selma, Montgomery, Alabama, when she was shot to death by the Klan on March 26, 1965. The writer says it was her face that got me. She was beautiful. The woman who gazed from the photo in the Gary Post Tribune in April 1965 was blonde and girlishly glamorous, wearing dark, I assumed, red lipstick. The photo was in black and white. To my young eyes, nothing about her face belonged in an article about civil rights, or could be remotely connected to the movement-inspired mayhem my family often saw on TV news. The face belonged to Viola Liuzzo, 39, a wife and mother of 5 who'd left her family in Detroit to drive to Alabama to march with Martin Luther King Jr., and now she was dead, shot after ferrying protesters in her car with a Negro man. As for with a Negro man in quotes, as African Americans were referred to then. I couldn't make sense of it. Didn't Liuzzo know about the water hoses and German shepherds being unleashed on people crazy enough to demand equal rights? Hadn't she seen the snarling white faces on TV so monstrously contorted with rage that even young black kids like me had to wonder, why do they hate me? Liuzzo's concern for Negroes meant her children were now motherless, a fact that had to be as unthinkable for them as it would have been for me. Would they hate me too? Thank you, Viola, so much. It's people like Viola who keeps history from repeating itself. Thank you, Viola. So I want to read you another one. This is in Mississippi from PBS, American Experience. Thank you, goodness, for PBS. Thank you, goodness, for the public broadcast service. Thank you, goodness, because that is one of the media resources I can say since my childhood I haven't seen any falter. Same with NPR. I haven't seen any falter in continuing to put out history as it is. It says on June 21st, 1964, 3 young men disappeared near the town of Philadelphia, Mississippi. Michael Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney worked for the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, in nearby Meridian. Andrew Goodman was one of hundreds of college students from across the country who volunteered to work on voter registration, education, and civil rights as part of the 1964 Mississippi Summer Project. The 3 men believed their work was necessary, but also dangerous. Ku Klux Klan membership in Mississippi was soaring in 1964, with membership reaching more than 10,000. The Klan was prepared to use violence to fight the civil rights movement. On April 24th, the group offered a demonstration of its power, staging 61 simultaneous cross burnings throughout the state. Over the course of the summer of 1964, members of the Klan burned 20 black Mississippi churches. On June 16th, Klan membership targeted Neshoba County Mount Zion Baptist Church, where Schwerner had spent time working. Pause there. I have to remind you, I am from Birmingham, Alabama. So I definitely know about the 4 little girls, and I've experienced the pain many years, 40 years, when I was a child, 40 years after that had been done. The pain still rested. It goes on to say, before burning the church, the Klan severely beat several people who had been attending a meeting there. Schwerner, however, was not there that day. He had gone to Oxford, Ohio to train a group of Freedom Summer volunteers. Upon returning to Mississippi, Schwerner, Goodman, and Chaney visited the charred remains of Mount Zion. On the drive back to Meridian, their station wagon, known to law enforcement as a CORE vehicle, was stopped, and police arrested all 3. Again, 2 of these are white, 1 is black. Cheney, who had been driving, was charged with speeding, while Schwerner and Goodman were held for investigation. Again, secrecy around it, because we know what this is really about. Neshoba County Sheriff's Deputy Cecil Price escorted them to the Philadelphia jail around 4 p.m. Despite the fact that the schedule of fines for speeding was posted on the wall, Price said the three men would have to remain in jail until the Justice of Peace arrived to process the fine. Bull, bull, bull. Schwerner asked to make a phone call, but Price denied the request and left the jail. In Meridian, Corps staff began calling nearby jails and police stations inquiring about the three men. Their standard procedure when organizers failed to return on time. You guys remember how I talked to you about how that oral tradition within Black American history has been so important. It's because that persona of white supremacy, white fragility, often tries to erase it and puts lies on top of it, behind their motivations, what it was. So it's important for Black Americans and those woke white folks, again taking back the word woke, those woke white folks who have been abolitionists in the past, have been civil rights sympathizers in the past, and today are woke white folks. We need those people to help shine a light on this darkness, because it's truly what it is darkness. But the core people keeping up with their staff members, I feel like that comes from that exact same sentiment. Minnie Herring, the jailer's wife, claimed there was no phone call on June 21st. Again, lying. But core records show a call to the Philadelphia jail around 5:30 p.m. Price returned a little after 10 p.m., collected Cheney's speeding fine with no justice of the peace, and told the three men to get out of the country. They were never seen alive again. In 1964, Mississippi was the only state without a central FBI office, but on June 22nd, agents from the New Orleans office arrived to begin a kidnapping investigation. Now, pause again. You remember how I told you, justice always catches up. It catches up. Even though this boys club mentality of, I'm going to cover you, even though you just committed murder. I'm going to cover you. You committed crime. I'm going to cover you. But the FBI and state law don't exist in the same jurisdiction. And FBI said, no. We're coming to figure out where these three people are. You're not getting away with it. Since passing in 1932, the Lindbergh Law brought kidnapping cases under federal jurisdiction. More agents would come to Mississippi over the next several days, ultimately totaling more than 200 federal agents coming to figure out where three people were. So guys, today, if you're doing the same stuff, if you're talking about doing the same stuff online, if you're forming hate groups, forming hate speech, making plans of violence, the law will eventually catch up with you. You want to rot in prison? You want to rot in somewhere worse after you pass away in prison? Keep on down the same route. On June 23rd, investigators found the Corps station wagon still smoldering from an attempt to destroy evidence. Now the focus shifted from rescue to recovery of men's bodies. The case was drawing national attention in part because Schwerner and Goodman were both white Northerners. So part of the reason why there was so much intentional effort into finding the one black guy is because he was accompanied by two white men. It is so shameful. But again, it's had to be so necessary that people make sacrifices to keep history true and honest, and to keep it as much as we can from repeating itself. The article goes on to say Mickey Schwerner's wife Rita, thank you goodness, we love you Rita, was also a Corps worker and tried to convert the attention to the overlooked victims of racial violence. She quoted, "The slaying of a Negro in Mississippi is not news. It is only because my husband and Andrew Goodman were white that the national alarm has been sounded." And she was right. It goes on to say, throughout July, investigators combed the woods, fields, swamps, and rivers of Mississippi, ultimately finding the remains of 8 African American men. 2 were identified as Henry D. and Charles Moore, college students who had been kidnapped, beaten, and murdered in May 1964. Another corpse was wearing a Corps t-shirt. Even less information was recorded about the other 5 bodies. So that right, they're searching for these 2 white men and this 1 black guy. And in doing that, they find 8 other African American men. And men, to emphasize that. These far right extremist groups want to make it seem like it's a figment of our imagination that black men are being attempted to be eviscerated off of this planet. This comes from a long history of violence. Again, imagine if it was you. How would you feel if your family member or your neighbor was found in a swamp or river or buried in a shallow grave? How would you feel? After 6 weeks of searching, a tip from an informant, later identified as Mississippi Highway Patrol Officer Maynard King, sent investigators to an earthen dam on the Old Jolly farm outside Philadelphia. It was there that the FBI discovered the bodies of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman on August 4th. Throughout the fall of 1964, the FBI continued investigating the case. State and local law enforcement did not pursue it, claiming insufficient evidence. The FBI continued investigating the case, but the state, the Old Boys Club, didn't pursue it. Because it was a crime covered by state law, the federal government could not bring charges. Instead, on December 4th, the Justice Department charged 21 men with conspiring to violate Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman's civil rights. Prosecutors brought the charges before a federal grand jury, which indicted 18 men. 18 men were involved in this debauchery. In January 1965, the following month, presiding Judge William Harold Cox dismissed the charges against the majority of the defendants, Boys Club, maintaining that the law applied only to law enforcement. In this case, Deputy Sheriff Price, the county sheriff, and a patrolman. The prosecution appealed, and in 1966, the Supreme Court reinstated the charges, ruling the law applied to both law enforcement and civilians. In February 1967, another federal grand jury indicted the men once again. In October, the trial began in Judge Cox's courtroom. I'm getting incredible deja vu here. You look at what's happening with all these indictments towards Donald Trump, and he's like it's like the cat and the mouse. The justice system being the cat, Donald Trump being the mouse. He can keep kind of tinkling away, and pretending that nothing's happening. I didn't incite hate. I didn't incite January 6th. I didn't have 24 Mexicans in ICE camps. I didn't preside over a barbaric presidency that placed blacks and brown peoples in unemployment. I didn't do that. But no, the justice system is catching up. It will catch up. Justice will be performed. It always is. So it says, and in October the trial began in Judge Cox's courtroom. Cox was known as a segregationist. He had been the subject of an unsuccessful impeachment attempt after describing African American witnesses in an earlier case as chimpanzees. But on the first day of the trial, when a defense attorney asked a witness whether Schwerner was a part of a plot to rape white women during the summer of 1964, Cox called the question improper, stating, "I'm not going to allow a farce to be made of this trial." Prosecutor John Doerr later called Cox's response to the rape question a turning point in the fight for justice. It quotes, "If there had been any feeling in the courtroom that the defendants were invulnerable to conviction in Mississippi, this incident dispelled it completely." Doerr said afterwards, "Cox made it clear he was taking this trial seriously. That made the jurors stop and think, if Cox is taking this stand, we'd better meet our responsibilities as well. It only takes one. It only takes one courageous person to inspire courage in others. As the trial proceeded, the prosecution read the 1964 confession of Horace Doyle Barnett and James Jordan, which described what happened on the night of June 21st. After leaving Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman in the Philadelphia jail, Cecil Price contacted Edgar Ray Killen, one of the leaders of the local Ku Klux Klan, who was also a Baptist minister. The irony. Killen directed Klan members to gather in Philadelphia that evening. When two cars filled with Klansmen headed for the outskirts of Philadelphia, Price released the civil rights workers from jail and ordered they head back to Meridian. He then joined the pursuit of the core station wagon. Catching up with the three civil rights workers on Highway 19, the Klansmen forced men into their cars and drove all the vehicles to Rock Cut Road, a nearby street. There, James Jordan shot Cheney, and Wayne Roberts shot Schwerner and Goodman. And I can just imagine, woo, 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 woo. I mean, this was 18 men. 2 people shot 3 people. But I can just imagine, woo, 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 all of this instigation and chaos and, fear-mongering and cheering each other on. I can just imagine the utter chaos. It probably looked like a scene from Dante's Inferno. So the killers loaded the bodies into the core station wagon and drove them to the Old Jolly Farm, where they used a bulldozer to bury the bodies in the earthen dam. The jury found 7 of the defendants guilty, and it lists the names. In 3 cases, the jury failed to reach a verdict. One juror refused to convict a minister, even though the minister incited murder, and Killen walked free. After unsuccessful appeals, the convicted men entered prison early in 1970. Each had received a sentence of between 3 and 10 years, but ultimately none served more than 6 years behind bars. In 1998, Jerry Mitchell, an investigative reporter for Jackson Clarion-Ledger, published excerpts with a 1984 interview with Samuel Bowers in which he spoke openly about the killings. He said, "I was quite delighted to be convicted and have the main instigator of the entire affair walk out of the courtroom a free man, which everybody, including the trial judge and the prosecutors and everybody else, knows that happened." Bowers said Mitchell's reporting established that Bowers was referring to Killen. The interview, which is now available to the public, it gives some further details about how this information was gathered and what missing holes were still there. I'm going to skip down a little bit and explain how Killen was eventually convicted in his old age. It says in 1999, this is 30 years after these murders were perpetrated. It says in 1999, Mississippi Attorney General Michael Moore announced that the state would reopen the case. At his request, the FBI turned over more than 40,000 pages to the initial investigation. In January 2005, a grand jury charged Edgar Ray Killen with murder. Although several of the other conspirators were alive at the time, the grand jury did not find sufficient evidence to indict anyone else. The trial drew national news coverage. And let me hold there. Although those other insiders of murder did not get indicted, I guarantee you they lived miserable, miserable lives until their deaths. The trial drew national news coverage. Members of the victims' families were present at the trial, some witnesses, and same as observers. Unfortunately, the jury found insufficient evidence for a murder conviction, but did find Killen guilty of a lesser charge of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison. I believe when he entered prison, he was about 60 years old. And when he died, he was around in his 80s. And he never, ever presented any remorse. Any remorse. I know where this man went. And it ain't pleasant. I know where he went and it ain't pleasant. Let's scope this back to today. So I'm going to wrap up with two things before coming back full circle here to how this all relates to Daniel Penny and Jordan Neely. If you are good with your critical thinking skills, you probably have already gotten there. So let's talk about the Tulsa Massacre. So this is an article from CNBC. This was released on May 31st, 2021. And this was written by Yun Lee. And it's an article entitled Black Wall Street was Shattered 100 Years Ago. How the Tulsa Race Massacre was covered up and unearthed. A lot of white supremacy, that persona of white supremacy, a lot of anxiety and hate and anger and aggression gets stirred up when black people in America progress. And you'll see that. You'll see every couple of decades, and on a bigger scale, every 100 years, 50 to 100 years or so, it gets rustled up, that white supremacy, because it hates, that in itself hates seeing black people enjoy the same advantages as whites in America. So the article says, a century ago this week, the wealthiest U.S. black community was burned to the ground. This is Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was the wealthiest black community in the U.S. at that time in 1921 before it was burned to the ground. And today, there's barely any black business in that neighborhood. That is not a coincidence. So it says, at the turn of the 20th century, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma became one of the first black communities in the country, thriving with black entrepreneurial businesses. The prosperous town, founded by many descendants of slaves, earned a reputation as the Black Wall Street of America and became a harbor for African Americans in a highly segregated city under Jim Crow laws. Now let me just explain this. A huge part of African American history and black owned businesses is like, we just kept on trying. We kept on trying to get jobs alongside white people, to get businesses alongside white people, to enjoy the same joys of life as white people. Kept getting knocked down. They said, no, you can't eat over here. You can't do business here. Get on over here, girl. Get on out of here, girl. Get on out of here, boy. You can't do business over here, boy. You can't do that. You can't do that. And so black people said, okay, fine. We'll go and do it on our own. And when they went and did it on their own and formed Black Wall Street, it got burned to the ground. So that is why cultivating a multicultural landscape in the U.S., but in the Western world generally, that reflects the population of these places is so important. We have to do it all together. Segregation is of the past, and we don't need to be going back. We have to do it all together. And for those who are as ignorant to say, go back to where you came from, black people in America did not choose to come to America. Citizens in black America are citizens because their ancestors got dragged to America, many of them dying. The article goes on to say, on May 31st, 1921, a white mob turned Greenwood upside down and one of the worst racial massacres in U.S. history. In the matter of hours, 35 square blocks of vibrant black community were turned into smoldering ashes. Countless black people were killed. Estimates ranged from 55 to more than 300, and 1,000 homes and businesses were looted and set on fire. For the longest time, the massacre received scant mentions in textbooks and civil rights and governmental conversations because, again, we want to just, slavery, it was such a long time ago. We don't have to talk about that in the textbooks. No, we need to talk about it in the textbooks. It wasn't until 2000 that the slaughter was included in the Oklahoma public schools curriculum, and it did not enter American history textbooks until recent years. The numbers, up to 300 black people killed and 1,000 homes destroyed. Take a look at these pictures and put yourself in those shoes. Imagine if you were there and you saw this happening. What spurred this was the alleged abuse of a white girl, which no evidence showed from a black person, which no evidence lent itself to. This is what destroyed an entire community, but we know that's not really what the reasoning was behind it. The reasoning behind it was racism at its core. I'm going to kind of skip down to conclusion. So it says, for Black Tulsans, the massacre resulted in a decline in home ownership, occupational status, and educational attainment. Knocked that whole community's struggles, 50 years of struggles of building all of that up, knocked them back. It says, according to a recent study through the 1940s led by Harvard University's Alex Albright, today there are only a few Black businesses on the single remaining block of the Greenwood district once held as Black Wall Street. This month, 3 survivors of the 1921 massacre, ages 100, 106, and 107, Black don't crack, appeared before a congressional committee, and a Georgia congressman introduced a bill that would make it easier for them to seek reparations. Meanwhile, historians and archaeologists continue to unearth what was lost for decades. In October, a mass grave in Oklahoma cemetery was discovered that could be the remains of at least a dozen identified and unidentified African American massacre victims. We are able to look for signs of survival and signs of life and really look for those remnants of built Greenwood and not just about how they died. Greenwood never left. I'm going to take you to one last thing before we get back to Daniel Penny. This video is from Tom Hartman, the Tom Hartman program on YouTube. Wonderful channel. I really, really recommend you guys all go look at it. So we see that, you know, with Daniel Penny, we can clearly see with Daniel Penny, with George Zimmerman, with Donald Trump, with Derek Chauvin, with Marjorie Taylor Greene, with the Oath Keepers, with the Proud Boys, with the Klan, with the neo-Nazis. We can clearly see that there is a new wave of white supremacy and neo-Nazism that's really sparked up in the United States. And we need to ask, why is that? Why now? What's happening? Because growing up in the late 90s, I was born in 91, but growing up in the late 90s and the early 2000s, it felt like the U.S. had gotten to an impeccable place. And by the time we got to Obama, it felt, whoa, we are worlds ahead of where we were 50 years ago and 100 years ago. And then all of a sudden, around 2015, like I've said many times, which you know who got elected in 2016, around 2015, something really, it just broke. But it seemed like a slow burning wave up to that, even leading up to that, you know, between 2007-ish and 2000, just a slow burning wave of growing racial tension and stemming of white supremacist groups. And now it's out of control. We've tried to ignore it. We tried to remain dignified and silent and just hope it'll go away. And it's spun out of control. So we have to ask what sparked that. And I looked at this program from Tom Hartman. I'm going to link it in the bio, and it was wonderful. And so he essentially says, he wrote an article, and he says, you know, he'll defend this argument in this video that he posed in the article of saying what was the catalyst that has ignited this wave of white supremacy and neo-Nazism that's stemmed back up in the U.S. was Barack Obama. And so he also goes in further to the Reconstruction, the years after the Civil War, where blacks in America were getting more rights and pointedly more representation within government. He talks about in the 1860s how essentially 1,500 African American men were elected into state legislatures during this period, and 17 African American men were elected into the U.S. House and the Senate. And that is when black voter suppression really started to happen in the U.S. He talks about that. So that was like phase one of what happened with Barack Obama. And then you saw white supremacy again stem up after Barack Obama became president. So I'm going to link this in the bio. Just look at the video. It's wonderful to look at. Guys, oh, my glass is so dirty. Oh, they're so dirty. Guys, Jordan Neely is nothing new, and all of the people who have upheld the name of a killer is nothing new. In history, we have had to have both whites and blacks who were willing to speak up for, I don't even like it. We've had to have whites and blacks who were willing to speak up and sacrifice for the greater good, for the common good. And right now, I'm so concerned for our young people because they're getting fed some weird version of history, where we don't want to acknowledge these pasts. And we don't want to acknowledge that you have to have compassion and empathy and ultimately a will for justice in your heart, a respect for the law and for justice because it's there for a reason. It protects all of us, And so, don't align yourself with this, guys. Truly, at the core of it, bigotry like what we saw in the Tulsa Massacre and the killing of those core activists during the abolitionist period, and the March on Washington, people with the civil rights movement who were transporting black voters and things like that. What we saw, the violence that we saw there, is essentially mental illness. It's mental illness wrapped up with a terrible understanding of history and of one's spirituality. There are studies that show that bigotry on this level is linked with a lesser level of intellectual competence and intelligence. It's linked with psychopathy. It's linked with the dark tetrad. With narcissism. What is it? Narcissism, Machiavellianism. What is the third thing? Narcissism, Machiavellianism. I know that psychopathy is one, and I can't think of the fourth one. But there's true mental illness wrapped up in this, and there's also a lack of exposure to your history, to your culture, to the history of others, to being around a multicultural group and having tolerance and compassion. So it's essentially to say, people raising $2.8 million for Jordan Neely tells me that all of these people have money to donate to a cause, but they don't have the will and the effort and the money to go out and get an education, to travel the world and see how other people live, to travel to other communities within their own villages, towns, cities, whatever, and see how other people live. And they'd have poor mental health. They don't have compassion in their hearts. So, young people, I urge you, if you have been radicalized, if you've been rolling into these online hate groups and forums, please, please, please heed my word. Go and read a book by Martin Luther King. Read a book by by James Baldwin. By James Baldwin. Read up on the Tulsa Massacre, on the March on Washington with Martin Luther King, on the Civil Rights Movement, on Jesse Jackson, the works of John Lewis. Go and read up on, and the election of these black senators and black representatives within government and how there was such lashback. Read up on the lynchings, but also go back further. Read up on the guillotine. Read up on, the feud between France and Britain that went on for forever. Read up on the Vikings. Read up on the Gauls and Celtic history. Know your history. Know your history and listen to others. Also, study up on African history. African history is not just Black American history. And for goodness sake, do not sell your soul in this life to feel a part of some community. Because if your community is founded on hate speech and violence and aggression towards any of God's creatures, you're not going to get to where you need to go in this life or the next one. So I'm praying for Jordan Neely's family. And it's so funny that I'm talking to you about this today because my mother is a teacher. I often will get people who come on this channel who say, stop preaching, stop race baiting. It's like, this is my channel last time I checked. But beyond that, I find it hilarious because I remember when I was younger, I guess since my mom being a teacher, I have a little bit of that spirit in me, a thirst for knowledge, and to share that with others. And that's what this channel is about. It's sharing experience, my perspective, my experience, my knowledge with others. And I remember I was playing a game when I was about, I'd say, let me see, I'm 7 years older than my nephew, and it's my oldest brother's son, but I'm closer in age to his son, and I think I was about 12. I was probably about 11 or 12, and we were playing school, and he's 7 years younger, so he had to be 4 or 5, something like that. And we were playing school. He was really having fun with it in the beginning. We were talking about math, talking about history, all types of stuff. And then after about maybe 30 minutes, he's like, can we stop playing school now? Are we done learning yet? Guys, never ever be done learning. Don't ever be done learning. And don't let history sell you some whitewashed, violent, suppressing version of itself. Know history for real. And remember that we're human beings. We exist on compassion. We have the will in us to do bad, but we also have a greater will in us to do good. The justice that is nature, that is karma, is always going to catch up with us. But the justice that is karma also, it allows for the justice that exists within our, democracies. So that is something that needs to be upheld and maintained. What I look at right now in the U.S. is really a lack of spiritual fruit. But I would know what you guys, I would like to know what you guys think. I'm praying for Jordan Neely's family. I'm praying that more young people will take up advocacy. More young people will take up nonviolent protesting and not rioting. I don't think you can say nonviolent rioting, but nonviolent stands and protests against racism, against sexism, against misogyny, against climate change denial, against transphobia, against homophobia. I'm praying that more and more young people realize how important these battles are. Don't allow yourselves to be silenced, guys. And even though it may seem hard to take that step forward in the beginning, to find your voice and to speak up for these things that protect everyone's morale, in the end, I think you're going to find on a cosmic level, on that spiritual level, you're going to feel better, because these people who have perpetrated and war, I have to imagine they're not very, very happy inside. And I have to imagine that the implications and consequences of their actions are dire in the life that we lead after this one. So guys, let me know what you think in the comments. If you're new here, please go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button, hit the bell so you know whenever I post a video, and I'll see you in the next one.